Bilingual Development in an Individual by Hayden Williams and Tessel 410, 2019. We have my table of contents, which includes my research questions, or the importance of my research theories, part 1, 2, and 3, demographics of my case study student, the language history of my case study students, and the learning goals for my case study students. Then we have the case study example 1, 2, and 3, and finally we go to the conclusion of the case study research and teaching recommendations and research recommendations. Next, so first up, we have our research question, which is how does language develop in an individual when they begin learning their language too at a young age? And guiding questions I've included are: does learning a second language affect the learner's language one when they're a child, and are there benefits to learning a second language? Why is this important? It's important to understand any benefits or negative effects that can arise from learning a second language and to counter any of these problems with support. It's important to see the progress of when a child's learning a second language, because then we can see the positivity behind it and disperse negative stigma that society has created some of society that has created that might be associated with learning a second language. Lastly, we can use this knowledge to possibly improve our own school systems and encourage the development and incorporation of learning a second language from a younger age in the general school system, because I do understand that there are school systems in the US that do teach second language from a younger age, but I'm talking about in general, like all across the states, all across the country. So we have our theories, and most of my theories will be revolve around Professor Jim Cummings, because he's the primary founder of theory of second language acquisition. So one of his big theories is BICS, which is basic interpersonal communication skills, and BICS is the conversational aspect of a language that English language learner children and adults experience when they're learning a new language. BICS is context-based, so that's primarily, but not limited to, picking up stresses or emphasize voice cues or facial expressions or reactions of others. It takes about 2 years for ELLs to pick this aspect of English up. Next we have CALP, which is Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. CALP is the context-reduced part of the academic language that takes much longer for ELLs to learn. This can take from about to 5-7 years for English language learners to learn/master. This is because academic language is really challenging and demanding and requires like a certain proficiency in literacy and knowledge, or even in the culture or linguistic background, in order for ELL to understand. Another thing that makes CALP challenging is the fact that there are less face-to-face communication, leading to less nonverbal cues for the ELL to see. So it all just comes down to what they know, what vocabulary they know, and maybe even the culture and linguistic background behind it. And then they have to use those skills alone to be able to understand their reading or whatever they happen to be doing. So it's much harder for them. Next, we have theories part 2. We have the Iceberg Model, and the Iceberg Model is just a well-known metaphor created by Jim Cummings to distinguish the differences between BICS and CALP. We have the Iceberg Model, or a picture of it, in the upper right-hand corner. They also have the dual Iceberg Model, but I chose not to incorporate this into my slides. But it's almost the same thing, just a more improved version of the original Iceberg Model. Next, we have the threshold theory, and there are 3 thresholds that somebody has to pass in order to obtain cognitive advantages in 2 or more languages, depending on what languages they're learning. The first threshold is when a person has the minimum or small level of competence in both languages, leaving them to have cognitive disadvantages. This would be somebody who has maybe they barely know how to read or write in their first language. So obviously when they're learning their second language, they're going to have to learn how to read and write. And it's just going to be disastrous overall. The learning process is just going to be a lot more difficult for them. The second threshold is when a person has age-level competence in one of their language. And in this case, they already have one language and they're not going to have any disadvantages or advantages to just knowing one language. The final threshold is when someone is at age-appropriate competence in both languages, leading to them to have cognitive advantages in both languages. Next, we have a CUP, which is common underlying proficiency. This theory revolves around the idea that if a person already has learned a concept, for example, the time or to paint, they don't need to relearn how to do these skills because it's already something you would know how to do if you traveled across the country. They just need to have the language in order to describe these actions or skills, abilities, and such. Finally, we have my third part of the theories, which is additive bilingualism. And this is when a child is learning 2 or more languages at one time and is able to maintain their language 1 while successfully learning their language 2. If the child is in a supportive learning environment where they can learn their second language and can still practice it while being able to go back home and continue learning their first language, they will successfully continue to learn both languages on a balanced scale, and their overall success in their academics will improve. Next, we have subtractive bilingualism, which is when a child forgets or loses their language 1 while learning their language 2. This can be due to, but is not always due to, unsupportive school systems which entirely cast out a child's language and culture, forcing them to acclimate to their new culture. And acclimate, if you don't know, means to essentially take on the new culture of a country that you happen to have moved to, and not use your own or forget about your own. This is something that can easily happen to a child. Next, we're moving on to my case study demographics. My case study student, I gave her a pseudonym because you're not allowed to use her real name, so I called her Queen. Her age, she's 19 years old. Her ethnicity, she's 100% Vietnamese. She was born and raised in Vietnam. That's the Vietnam flag, if you didn't know, in the upper right-hand corner. Her personal history, in middle school, high school, and even elementary school, she were bilingual schools. So she had to study both English and Vietnamese at the same time. So she had classes for English and Vietnamese. And this was stressful because she had to take about even 10 tests for her English and her Vietnamese classes together, combined, so she has double the tests that we had. Then she decided to go to America to study so that her English studies wouldn't go to waste, and she has been living in the US for 3 years now. Her language history, she is, Vietnamese is her native language because she was born in Vietnam, and she's primarily when she was in primary school, she began learning in English in first grade as a requirement. In third grade, she began learning Mandarin because her mother wanted her to. She quickly dropped Mandarin because she had no real interest in the language, and it was just a trend at the time for moms and parents to teach their children Mandarin. She just wasn't interested in it. Now she can only count in Mandarin. That's essentially it. Then she began studying abroad in Washington State. She went to Wacom University and took an intro to French class for 1 quarter, but stopped then, and she has continued to learn English at Western Washington University. This is actually her first quarter here, and she is a proficient English language user and uses English daily and can even translate academic tests and write essays on such things. So she's got her bigs and calps at the moment. Her case study goals, when I first met her, she was already very fluent in English, so it was hard to create goals. However, we decided on grammar because she has a hard time trying to tell what is right and what's wrong sometimes. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just hard for her to understand. And she occasionally slips on a few plurals, and she puts them where they're not supposed to be, which is fixable. Then we have, not that that's a problem, and then we have vocabulary. People are learning vocabulary every day, and this is also something that she has to do. She's probably learning double the amount of vocabulary words that we're using, and she just wants to expand her use of vocabulary because it's still smaller than our, let's say, like a normal English language user's kind of vocabulary would be. So she wants to expand it so she can write easier, speak easier, and just create better academic papers. So next we have our first case study example, and it has to do with her learning 2 languages growing up. She first started learning Vietnamese as a baby, and she had adopted it as her first language at the time when she started learning English in kindergarten or first grade, I believe. During her years at school, she had to attend an English class and a Vietnamese class, as I mentioned before. This led to her schooling of the 2 languages to be equal all the way up to high school. After graduating from high school, she moved to America to study in an American university, so all of her years of learning English wouldn't go to waste. Did she struggle with her school's strict classwork? She was very honest with me. She said she couldn't remember much because she was a child at the time. But she does remember that it was very hard, and all the students were also they were just all at the same level. They all found it very hard, but they were all learning at the same time, at the same rate, so none of them fell behind. And all of them got to practice English on the daily, so because they all learned English pretty quickly and found it as easy to use as Vietnamese, or at least Queen did. Speaking and writing wasn't difficult for her. Once she acquired the language as a child, her language learning was balanced, which led to her obtaining age-appropriate cognitive development and advantage in both languages. So next we have case study example 2, her further development of English once she moves to the US. Studying abroad was difficult as she had to leave her family behind to go to a whole new country to use her second language. When it came to applying her second language to the US, she ran into some issues. One of them involved her difficulties that she had with trying to understand slang or informal English because she was taught by a textbook and people, English speakers that were older, so they didn't have the slang. So she had a lot of misunderstandings, and she was too embarrassed to speak sometimes because she didn't understand what some people were saying. And she had a quiet period that lasted about 2 months until she became more accustomed to the US in general. Final case study example is her current use of language. The primary language that Queen uses is actually her English. She goes home and she talks to her cats in English. She calls her sister and talks to her sister and hangs out with her sister and talks in English. Because she's comfortable with the language. And she only speaks Vietnamese when she's talking to her mother on the phone or her family, and she goes to visit her family in Vietnam, she's using Vietnamese. Even though she seems to use English more than Vietnamese, she still maintains a strong level of proficiency in both languages. Her personal thoughts on benefits on being bilingual. The first one I thought was quite funny because she said in Vietnamese, you can't talk about certain subjects because they are taboo. Due to this, she never got to learn the words associated with those topics, so you couldn't really talk about them. However, when she learned English, she was able to talk about these topics and talks about them whenever she wants, which is a bonus in her book. Another benefit she talked about was the opportunity, or just having the opportunity to study abroad and go to an entirely new country to further her learning. And this was all because she had learned English, so it was easier for her to study abroad. And because she already knew the language, when she did come to study abroad, she didn't have to enroll in AUAP or IEP classes at Western or even Wacom, which I believe they have those classes as well, which is also a bonus in her book. Not that it's bad if you have to enroll in AUAP or IEP or and such. So then my conclusion for my case study is, did Queen get to achieve her goals? Overall, we did get to practice on vocabulary words. I would check up on her all the time to make sure she understood what I was saying, and we'd go over words and such. And grammar issues, we didn't really get too far into that because grammar is kind of something you need to know the technicalities of, and you have to practice it if you want to teach it. And at that moment, I wasn't prepared to teach something like that to her. However, And also to add on to it, vocabulary is a lifelong journey in any language. You're always learning new words constantly, especially in English. So that's something that you can improve on, but you can't obtain the goal. But we'd say that she was overall successful in what we were able to accomplish in this quarter. What have I learned? Well, meeting with Queen this whole quarter, I've learned a lot more about bilingual people than I have my entire life, which is a lot because I hang out with I don't hang out, my family is bilingual. My whole family, my coworkers, like a lot of people that I encounter are bilingual because of my mom, which is great. I love my mom. Queen is a prime example of a successful bilingual person who was able to use her skills and capabilities to her advantage. She is a living example that if a child is in the proper learning environments, they will be able to successfully learn both languages. Her childhood experiences and current experiences clearly demonstrate many of J. Cummings' theories that have been developed over the years. Recommendations for instructors and further research. I would recommend for ELL instructors to, if they are teaching a child, don't take away the child's use of their first language. They should use it to teach and use their culture and try to really just incorporate them into the school system rather than cast them aside or put them in a special education group that just kind of strips them of their language and culture. And to also encourage language learning, they should recommend to parents or guardians to keep teaching the children their first language as they grow, and this will make it so the child won't experience subtractive bilingualism and then will instead create an environment for the child to prosper in. Research has also shown that if a child who is able to continue using their language 1, they will be able to learn other subjects in their language 2 easier than those who are stripped of their language 1. Recommendations for further research. Since there is a lot of research on younger children, there's not really any research on older children or teenagers. I'd love to see more research on them just to see, how do they develop language differently than, adults or children. It's just something that'd be interesting to learn about. And then we could maybe even improve school systems for them or school learning systems. I believe researchers should also look into schools in America where children are learning second language at a young age and compare those bilingual children with monolingual students. And while they may do this right now, I think they should just do it overall. Sometimes it's hard to tell, and a lot of the times I think the bilingual students that they're studying are in other countries, and I just like to see how different it is in the US. And then if we see good results, I think we should just incorporate learning second language when children are younger, just to really just give them that cognitive advantage over other people, and then they can travel a country, go to that country, maybe even get a job or schooling in that country. It just adds a lot onto their life, and they get a little more spice. Lastly, we have my sources. I have about 6 sources, one of them including a slideshow by Susie. Thank you for watching or listening. You have a great day.